Our presenter today is Dr. Peter Sheldrake. Peter is an adjunct faculty at the Wake Forest School of Business and the School of Medicine, where he teaches innovation and commercialization. Each year, Peter splits time between the US and Australia, where he also teaches at RMIT in Melbourne in the areas of innovation, entrepreneurship, and global business strategy. Outside of academia, he has held key leadership roles in the Australian government, Shell Oil, and the Australian Institute of Management. Peter, I'll now go ahead and turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Kerry, and welcome to everyone. What I'm going to try and do over the next 45 minutes is say a little bit about what's going on at the present time, a little bit about why the future isn't quite as difficult to think about as we might believe, and then discuss a little bit about what we can do to address the changes that are going to develop over the next few years. So this will really be in three parts. So part one's going to be about change, and then parts 2 and 3 will be about what we can do about change. And I guess that the big issue right now is that we're kind of looking ahead and the world seems rather uncertain. In fact, when I was thinking about this webinar, I started doing a little bit of reading so I could find out what everybody was telling me is going to happen in the future. And these were just a few of the things that popped up. I discovered, first of all, that lots of people were saying we're going to see a major shift with government. It's going to be controlling a lot more. We're going to have to accept that intervention in our lives is going to be dominating. And then I read some other articles saying, no. Actually, what's going to happen is that we're going to see that political and ideological principles are going to be softened, things are going to be more flexible, things are going to be more community-based in the future. That was a little bit confusing. And then I saw that, well, the one thing we do know is that income inequality is going to increase, and there are going to be higher income workers, and they're mainly going to be able to work from home. And the rest of people are going to be in a less advantageous situation. Oh no, sorry, got that wrong too. What's actually going to happen is that the government and its policies are going to shift away from an obsession with economic productivity, and we're going to see a much greater emphasis on a broadly based safety net for everyone. And then I read that community cohesion is going to increase because people have realized that differences have really grown in recent years, and it's time to support each other. Or just a minute, no, I got that wrong too. Governments are going to actually become much more concerned about dealing with states of emergency, restricting rights, and having a big impact on freedom and liberties. Forget about the community. And then, and this is the last of these, they were all just things I read in the newspaper, there's going to be a major change taking place, and that companies are going to be looking towards functioning much more effectively through robots, through online workforces, and there's going to be a lot of offices closed, smaller businesses are going to disappear. Or no, sorry, I might have got that wrong too. Perhaps what we're going to see is there's going to be the opportunity for us all to reevaluate our lives, rethink our priorities, and even start making changes for a net positive environment. Well, I'm not expecting you to believe any of those things. I'm just trying to say right now, life does seem rather unpredictable. And if anyone was asked to say, what is it going to be like in 2021? I think the answer is we simply just don't know. Lots of people like to say we're living in a VUCA world. And I think that's a helpful thought. A VUCA world is a world where there is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Actually, we've been in that world for quite a while. All that's been happening in the last 2 or 3 months is things seem a little more volatile, a little more uncertain, certainly very complex, and certainly very ambiguous. In economic terms, yes, we all know that there's been the slow emergence of a multipolar world, and right now regionalism is becoming even stronger. And at this particular point in time, we also see a great deal of instability in things like just-in-time international supply chains, partly because countries are closing their borders and partly because concerns are leading to a great deal of anxiety about the risk of using international supply chains. Politically, well, politically it's been volatile for a while. All we see right now is that a lot of tensions are becoming heightened. And very interestingly, we see in many countries around the world, radical parties and new governments are suddenly emerging and becoming very important. And yes, that does mean that uncertainty and ambiguity are kind of really ruling the waves right now. Anything can come to us from anywhere, it seems, and from anywhere in the world. And even more puzzling and difficult to deal with, people who were our partners last year are suddenly no longer as reliable and in some cases very threatening. Yep, we're living in a VUCA world. In fact, let's be clear, before I go any further, the one thing that we can predict about the future is you can't predict the future. I know that sounds silly, but it's going to be very important to reinforce that because I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that I think might be happening. But I want to be very clear, I'm not predicting the future. I'm simply helping you think about the future. Because being strategic has to be about trying to work out what we're going to be doing in the future. And strategic innovation is really sitting at a point right now where there are two things you can do. You can either be kind of, if you like, small scale innovative. You can keep on doing what you've always done and do it very well, or you can decide to be rather more innovative. And I want to talk a little bit towards the end about how we can actually be more innovative and do things that are quite different from what we've done before. We're going to go through 3 stages. We're going to talk a little bit about how we can look systematically at what might happen in the future, how we can anticipate. And given I've said you can't predict the future, that might sound a bit odd, but I'll explain more in a moment. Secondly, I'm going to touch on a theme I quite often talk about, which is our willingness to rethink how we understand our customers, our clients. And then towards the end, I want to talk a little bit about what I call upside down thinking. And underlying all of this is that I think it's going to be very important for those companies, those organizations that do want to do things differently in the future, that they're going to be willing to throw off what I call handicapping traditions. In fact, I'm going to give you an example right now. Sitting on my computer, I can't see it right now, but I know it's there, and sitting on my smartphone, I've got all these little icons that take me onto various kinds of programs and other sorts of activities I can engage in. Now, those graphic user interfaces were developed by Apple many years ago, and now they've become the way in which we think about using services on our computer. And I think that actually GUIs, as they are today, are becoming as much of a handicap as they are a help. And anyone who can't remember where they've put one of those icons when they've got several pages of them will know what I'm talking about. You spend 2 or 3 minutes just fiddling around trying to find what it is you want to do. So here's an example of something which we've got so used to, we no longer ask the question, is that the best way to do things? And that will be very much the theme of what I'm going to be talking about over the next half hour or so. So what do I mean by thinking systematically about what might happen? Well, the first thing is we do actually have some data about the future. It's not that we don't know anything at all. It's not predicting the future, but there are some things that we know in terms of developments and trends and patterns, which we can be, well, let's say, reasonably confident about. So here's an example. I was just reading recently that if you look at the world's projected population between now and 2015, just 9 countries are going to account for half of the world's projected population increase. And you can see them there: India, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, the USA, Uganda, and Indonesia. And because you're all very smart, you'll notice I've put 3 of those countries in italics. And the reason I did that was because in the case of India, The USA and Indonesia, the reason they're going to be contributing to a significant degree towards the world's population increase is because they're already big countries. And so even a relatively small rate of growth will add a lot of people. But that leaves Nigeria, the Congo, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, and Uganda. 5 of those 6 countries are in Africa. And that must give us pause for thought. Here are 5 countries in Africa, not huge countries, that are going to grow enormously. In fact, I decided I would chuck in a slide I quite often use, just to make that point a little bit further. This now is not about numbers, but it's about something else. This is about the shifting balance between young and old. And we can look through those various lines and say to ourselves, kind of interesting, isn't it? So let's go down to America. We know that country well. In 2015, about 19% of the population was aged under 15 and about 15% aged over 65. By 2050, and we can't be surprised at that, the country is aging, so the percentage of younger people will have dropped a little bit, down to 17.5%, and the percentage of older people will have gone up to about 22%, 23%. Well, you can look at all the others down there, and I guess the one immediately above America is really very interesting, because Japan has only 13% under 15, 26% aged over 65 right now. And by 2050, the percentage under 15 will have gone down a little bit more. The percentage of older people will have gone up very considerably. What's the difference between Japan and America? Well, despite all the things that are said about immigration, America is still a country that has immigrants and Japan does not. Japan is, in a sense, a picture of the future. I'll let you look at those other numbers for a moment, but I'll just pick on Africa again. Remember, Africa was where 5 of the 9 countries that are going to contribute to half the world's growth in population are in Africa. 41% of people in Africa are under 15, 3.5% aged over 65. In 2050, it will still be a third aged under 15 and only 6% aged over 65. So that growth in Africa is going to be a growth among young people. And that means, of course, if we think about it, the growth in the number of older people is going to continue for quite some time. Africa is going to be a really extraordinarily important part of the world, as China knows, and so do some other countries who have been busily building links there. Well, that was an easy example. And it's one I quite often use, just simply to make the dramatic point. We don't know nothing. We can be reasonably confident about demographic changes, especially in the immediate future. But what I want to do is to say that what we see right now is that things have been changing for a while. And that process of change has a lot to do with what some people call the digital or knowledge revolution. In terms of innovation, the theme we're going to keep coming back to, so much has been going on. Companies now don't necessarily see themselves just as the internal group of people, but they network with other organizations. They bring in experts, academics, retired staff, contract labor pools, and of course, increasingly have staff who work from home and never go into the business. It's what we sometimes call distributed co-creation. Social networking, of course, is booming. The use is going up considerably. People are writing blogs much more. Video sharing is increasing. So all of a sudden, not only are companies operating differently, but the digital world is having a bigger impact on how we connect. Of course, there's a great big concern about the impact of the Internet of Everything, devices communicating with each other. You'll know all that stuff. And of course, we know that there's a great deal of interest in looking at customers, particularly at the idea of identifying each single customer rather than marketing to groups. And another thing that's been going on, and again, the IT and knowledge revolution has been affecting this, is that there has been a degree of re-intermediation. 30 years ago, everybody was focusing on their bit of the business. Now businesses are saying, let's buy back in the suppliers, let's buy back in the distributors, let's control the whole of our destiny. All that has been going on, is going to continue in the future. Looking back is always very interesting. You know, everyone talks about disruptive innovations. And of course, I would love to have been the inventor of the mobile telephone. But let's be clear about this. Really disruptive innovations are pretty rare. Technological changes, however, can be very important. You probably don't remember because it's so many years ago, but there was something called the MP3 format that was developed. It was a kind of virus. It ate into things like CDs, so that all of a sudden music could be downloaded digitally. You didn't have to buy an object to get it. And it had a huge impact on companies that used to sell recorded music. Then, of course, we see that companies over the last 20 or 30 years are having to rethink where profits can be found in the future. In fact, that same music industry doesn't make so much money now out of selling music. It makes some, but not very much. I think a very successful performer gets $1,000 for 1 million downloads. That's not very much money for a lot of downloads. But where the music industry is focused today, of course, is on merchandising and performance. And then my final example of how things happen is that we can look at Rolls-Royce. I often use this example. This is not Rolls-Royce the cars. This is Rolls-Royce, the aero engine company. And Rolls-Royce today does not make its money out of selling jet engines. The profits on those are very low. It does not make much money out of leasing jet engines, which is how most people obtain their jet engines. It makes its money today out of what it called a few years ago engine health management, the maintenance process. And why do they make money out of that? Because they control that process, because they collect data from every jet engine every time it's running continuously. So that now the most valuable asset that Rolls-Royce has in many ways is the data it has on its engines, which it can use for maintenance, which it can use for checkups, and which it can use to design better jet engines. And all of this means that we are continuing to see a process. It's going to be accelerated this year, that companies' lives are getting shorter. Standard & Poor's top 500 companies used to be 500 years or more old. Today, the average age is shrinking down, somewhere around 15 to 20 years. And I think we'll see a lot more go soon. So the competitive environment is important for us to think about. Embedded intelligence, that was all that stuff about digital devices communicating. Individualization, we know about that. But there's a couple of other things that are going to be very important, I think. Convenience is extremely important. And if anything that's happened through the coronavirus issue in terms of the effect on many businesses, it is the ability of a customer to be able to go online and get what they want instantly. They also hope it will arrive instantly, which is proving to be slightly more problematic. Secondly, language. We've been very comfortable for a long time that English is the world's business language, and that is slowly but very clearly shifting. And the usage of languages like Mandarin is increasing enormously. So language and managing language is going to be very important. And sometimes I talk about something called globalization, which is about the ability of a company to be able to use both its global reach, but at the same time understand what's happening locally. Oh, and of course, just in case you hadn't noticed, big companies are gobbling up smaller companies and will do so even more so over the course of the next year or so. So the big key to looking ahead is understanding this digital interconnected world. I like to say that I think we've reached, if not past, a very important point in relation to innovation and the digital world. And that's where, instead of talking about best practice, we really need to look ahead and ask about next practices. We could use my GUI example for a moment. I mean, it seems to me that if I'm right, that the little apps sitting on the phone are kind of old-fashioned, I can see a future and a next practice where when you want to use your mobile phone, you just simply mention the app you want to use and it's automatically operating. By the way, I love science fiction. You'll find lots of great ideas about what might happen in the future in science fiction. If you accept my view that next practices are important, then you can look ahead and think about what might happen and then look back to see what you could do to identify that trend becoming likely. Focusing on the customer as an individual, AI and AR, all of those things are becoming very important too. I started thinking of the example of hand surgery, don't ask me why, and I thought about augmented reality. I'm sure you've seen examples of how a guy working on a piece of equipment can put on some goggles and look at that equipment and at the same time see the blueprint overlaid on the equipment so he can see exactly where he needs to go to fix something. So I asked myself, so why do we expect a doctor to learn all of the bones in the hand? There are a lot of them in order to be able to do surgery. Why can't the same technique be used and augmented reality be used to impose on top of a hand and see all the bones and identify what it is you might want to be addressing? Already mentioned social media, you can see those figures. Facebook, unbelievably, 2.5 billion monthly users, YouTube 2 billion, Instagram 1 billion. And messaging is increasing enormously. So we can just see that this social media area is going to keep on growing. Oh, and of course, we are all Zooming nowadays. I won't say much about scenarios. I just want to say that we can look at trends, we can look at ideas about where things are going to head. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Scenario thinking can be very useful. We can imagine possible futures, and we can use those possible futures to develop contingency plans. A lot of companies today are asking the question, why won't we prepare for a pandemic? My question would have been, why won't you prepare for a disaster? You didn't have to prepare for a pandemic, but every good business should have a scenario where their supply lines, their customer interface, even their workforce is dramatically affected and have a plan to deal with that. The value of scenario thinking is exactly that. It puts you in the place where you've already started to think about what you could do if the future turned out to be different from the world we're in right now. I can't recommend it more strongly. So what am I saying in this first part of this presentation? I'm saying to you that we have to be alert to what's changing, and we have to think about what might change. Now, I'm sure you all read your trade journals, and that's very good. I'm sure you network and talk to people. I hope you also spend time watching your competitors. It's the last three that I think we don't spend enough time on. First of all, I think it's essential today that you keep an eye on events that are taking place outside your area. You need to know what's happening in Nigeria right now, because Nigeria is a rapidly growing, extremely important country, which is becoming important in economics, important in trade, and an important place in which other nations are trying to carve out a space to do business and to utilize the workforce. We just got to watch those kinds of things. You need to watch what's happening in computing and all this strange stuff about different forms of computing. Why is that important? Because that may well have a huge impact on how information technology develops in the next few years. And so it goes on. That there are many, many areas where you just need to keep an eye on things, not because it's your business, but because it could impact on your business. And that relates to that next point, which is about technological breakthroughs. I regularly read several different sources just to try and understand what's been changing recently, what's the big new thing that's happening, and why does that matter? Is it just interesting, or is it going to be very significant? I know some of you are interested in things to do with medical care. So the whole immunotherapy thing was a big, big change a few years ago. We don't quite know where some of all of this genetic work is going to lead, but there are some big breakthroughs taking place in areas like medicine, and you need to keep an eye on them. But finally, I want to go back to that VUCA slide and say to you, remember that, pay attention to broader developments. not just technological, not just the issues in your industry, but ask yourself what's happening politically, what's happening socially, what's happening economically. And especially at a time like this one, where there's a lot of dramatic change going on, keep your eye on things. See if you can see what one person used to call the song beneath the words. Can you see underneath all of that stuff what is happening? Simple example, there is just no doubt right now that in the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen an increasingly conservative approach by governments around the world, an increasingly conservative approach which leads to an increasing desire to begin to look after their own interests and not be so willing to collaborate with others. That's an international and a very important trend. It will have big consequences. So that's my question on this topic. How are you paying attention? Make sure that you, every day, every week, set aside some time not to panic about this week's sales figures, not to panic about paying your staff, but asking some bigger questions about what on earth is going on. All right, I'm sure that will lead to 1 or 2 questions. Now let me move on to a theme which some of you may have heard me talk about before, which is about customers. And I guess before I get into this, I'm going to make a very simple but important statement about my views on this. We are very good at looking at customers. We are very good at collecting data on customers. We are very good at putting together marketing plans and segmenting customers. We do all of those things very well. We collect lots of data. We do lots of analysis. I think we do a relatively poor job of actually understanding customers. And I want to explain what I mean by that and try and explain why I think it's so important. What do I mean by understanding customers? Well, I think there are 3 things there. The first thing is that we don't spend enough time living inside the head of our customers. So we observe what they're doing, but we don't understand why they're doing something. And there's a very good approach to this, which I often talk about. It's called asking the question, what is the job the customer wants done? Not what are they doing, but what is it they want done? What's inside their head that is leading them to do something? And I'm going to use an example in just a moment. That's really critical, because if we better understand the job the customer wants done, then we're in a much better position to actually develop a product or a service or a strategy which is going to be attractive to that customer and to customers like that one. There's a second puzzle about understanding customers, and I know for many of you this is a really tricky area. We have customers, we have clients, but they have customers. And so sometimes it's not just understanding our customers, the ones who we talk to, the ones who pay us money, but we need to understand their customers and even their customers. So I quite often draw a distinction between those immediate customers, the ones that we deal with, and what I call the end use customers, the people at the end of the chain, the people who are the ones who pay the last bit of the process, the person who goes into the shop to buy something, the person who takes their car in to be serviced. So critical in getting a better handle on understanding customers is being clear about which customer are we talking about and why does each category of customer matter. And then finally, we have to think about how we connect with our customers. And, you know, the last 2 or 3 months, I think, has been really very good in opening a lot of companies' minds to seeing that today, digital interfaces, digital technologies are extraordinarily important, and important in ways that perhaps we hadn't fully understood before. We now see customers have high expectations about the interface with a company. They have high expectations about convenience and speed. They have high expectations about responsiveness. And they are very familiar with digital technologies. They don't have a puzzle over using them. They sometimes have a considerable puzzle over the way in which they get a response. I always talk about this example, so I'm not going to go into it. It's kind of boring after a while, but it is very interesting to go into a fast food outlet. and just look at people going into that outlet. And should you ever be able to go back to a fast food outlet and sit in it, I recommend you do this. It might not be for a while, but when you're sitting there and think about it when you used to be able to do it in the past, what you see is a number of customers who are coming in to do very different things. Some are coming in to get a coffee, or maybe a bagel, or maybe a muffin, I don't know, whatever it may be. Some are coming in with a couple of friends and they get a coffee, but they're really there to have a chat. Some people called students, and maybe some people working are there to get on with some work. They need a working space. They might buy a cup of coffee so they don't feel embarrassed, but then they settle down for 2 or 3 hours and happily enjoy themselves working away. So that fast food outlet is actually a workspace for them. Some people come in to use the restrooms. Some people come in for what I can only describe as assignations. They want to meet someone. Maybe they don't want other people to know they're meeting someone. It could be a business partner, or it could be another kind of partner. So they want to go somewhere which is relatively impersonal and where they can talk to someone with, in a sense, the privacy of being surrounded by people they don't know. Why does that matter? Well, if you look at how good fast food outlets operate, and I often use Starbucks as my example, they've become very smart at trying to work out how can we make sure that we understand what the customer wants done, to meet someone, to get a coffee, to get some food, to use the restroom, etc., to use the Wi-Fi, and to try and provide an environment and services and products that meet a wide variety of jobs that need to be done. I don't think I need to go further on illustrating that, other than to say, next time you're in a Starbucks, have a look around and ask yourself, has the layout of this particular Starbucks met many of the jobs that want to be done by the customers you see coming in? I see some that are very good. I see some where, for reasons of space or for reasons of concern over turnover, they're not quite as amenable to all those different customer interests. So let's continue on coffee for just a little bit longer. Let's just imagine that right now we're thinking about coffee. We decided we're going to make coffee at home, so we go into the supermarket. There's an interesting place to think about coffee. You go into the supermarket and there you see those rows of different kinds of coffee. And if you're a customer, you may well have a preference. If you're a smart customer, you might know that your particular variety comes up cheaper every so often, so you tend to buy when it's cheaper. You may like to grind your coffee when you're in the supermarket. You might like to buy it pre-ground. There's a whole lot of options sitting there, and supermarkets are relatively good at doing that. Except, of course, if you look carefully, you'll realize they are certainly promoting some brands, often their own brand, and other ones with which they got a particularly good deal, and other brands are harder to find, higher up on the shelves, lower down on the shelves. But you're only part of that deal. The supermarket also has its suppliers. It's a customer to the Pete's, the Starbucks, and all the other suppliers of coffee into the supermarket. And so now the supermarket has to think about both how it can sell coffee to the customer and how it can provide good service to the suppliers and maximize their income. And then the supermarket has to ask the question, so what can we do to enhance the service to the end use customer, which will also benefit the supplier? And you all will have seen that we now have all of these different K-cup systems and so on. It used to be that when you went into a supermarket, you could also get little notes of guidance about how to make coffee and what different varieties of coffee mean. I noticed that's gone, and I wonder why. Okay, we bought our coffee, we're going home. We need to buy a cordless drill because we've got to do some work when we get home. We're going to buy a cordless drill? Why? The research on cordless drills shows that for the average consumer, not obviously a home builder or a handyman, they use their cordless drill for around 8 minutes a year. So they're paying $80 to use something for 8 minutes. So why buy it? It's been very interesting to see in Europe, there are a lot of places now called borrowing shops. And borrowing shops is where you can go and get something like a cordless drill or whatever other piece of equipment it is you want. Some of them are free. You just pay a membership to be part of the borrowing shops. Some borrowing shops charge a small fee, but you don't need to charge much of a fee to recoup your $80 on a cordless drill for all the people who want to come in and just use it for a day. What's equally interesting, and it goes back to my comment about coffee, is that people who want to get a drill also like borrowing shops, because there are people who are there to talk about what they can do, what kind of bit they might use, why this drill might be more advantageous, why they might not actually want to use a cordless drill. And all of a sudden, people in borrowing shops are discovering it's the service that's more important than the product. So let's just stop there for a moment. All of this is about saying critical in thinking about being innovative in the future is getting a deep understanding of customers inside their heads. What is it they are trying to do? And how can you better respond to that? So let's end with thinking upside down. What is thinking upside down? Thinking upside, I do like that picture. Thinking upside down is saying, should I turn things on their head? Let's see if we can understand why. As I see it, business models have been changing a lot in recent years. 25, 30 years ago, a very large number of businesses simply manufactured or developed or grew products or services and then sold them to customers directly or through intermediaries. Now, manufacturers are moving from the product to the service. We've just been talking about examples of that. I started thinking about banks, and banks are facing challenges over convenience and safety. And so all of a sudden there are things like blockchain, and there are processing systems like WorldPay, which are beginning to take over from the benefits of the individual bank. And people are asking, why do I need to use that bank? Isn't blockchain going to give me the security I really need? Why can't I have real-time processing? I can see I can get that this way. Schools and colleges are threatened by MOOCs, massively online open courses. And I suspect a lot of colleges in 2021 are going to have to rethink how they work with their students. And I'll come back to them in just a moment. And of course, the gig economy is booming. There are so many new intermediaries into areas like transport, home services, restaurants, taxis, retails. So business model innovation is a hugely important thing. What's a business model? A business model is, of course, a way of realizing the value in a product or service and making sure that a customer is going to pay for the value that you're offering. There are lots of different business models. Manufacturing was very strong. Assembling is one, building is one, developing is one, licensing is one, franchising is one, accrediting is one. You can be a service provider, an educator, an intermediary, a consultant, a problem solver. You can provide raw materials, logistics support, a trading platform, marketing insights. You can provide security, you can provide validation. The big question to ask today is there another business model that might be a more effective way of providing an interface between you and the customers that you want to address? So what does thinking upside down mean? Thinking upside down means taking something and chucking it out of the door. Well, I mentioned Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce makes the money in its core business now out of information. I mentioned MP3s and the fact that the recording music industry doesn't make much money out of recording. It makes it out of merchandising and out of putting on various kinds of concerts. So what do we do to think upside down? Well, we quite simply say, what are the ways in which we operate today? Some people say we analyze what are the sacred cows in our business. And then you ask the question, could we get rid of those sacred cows? Could we do everything differently? Could we turn the business upside down? And most importantly, could we rethink the customer relationship? I mean, I could have used the example of a university. Universities always fascinate me. I've said that online courses are going to be very important. Maybe universities should stop thinking about running degree programs in the way they do at the present time, that is, putting together the degree program and marketing it to students, and turn the thing on its head and say to students, you put together what you think would be the degree program you would like to do. We can put together the modules that you will take. You can study them online. You can come in for some or all face-to-face. It can be blended as you like, but we will accredit what you've done. So the role of the university becomes an accreditor and an intermediary, giving a student the opportunity to acquire things they want to learn. Does that mean that's the end for universities? That's a useful role. Oh, the other thing a university could do is go back to a more traditional role it used to have, which was to be a centre of research, so that universities become research and accrediting institutions. They make money out of accrediting for students who want to get recognition for what they've learned, and they make money out of research when that research becomes something that can be sold or licensed or passed on. And in fact, I'm going to end by saying that maybe I should have thought upside down about this particular webinar. See, I could have done this differently. And in fact, when I had this idea a few days ago, I kind of mentally kicked myself. See, I wanted to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about strategic innovation. I don't actually know what you're interested in. So what I should have done is I should have asked Kerry, poor long-suffering Kerry, I should have said to Kerry, why don't you say there's going to be a webinar on strategic innovation or thinking upside down or whatever title you want to give, and say to each person who's interested, let me know what it is you would like to learn about. Then he could have sent each one of those lists to me, and I could have structured my presentation around the things that you wanted to know about. Why didn't I think of that several days ago? Kerry, don't answer that question. I just didn't, all right? And I shouldn't have done. But I think it's a good example. The tradition is the expert, supposedly, puts together a program and talks about it. How about the presenter listens to what people want to learn about and sees what he or she can put together to give them assistance? All right, I think we have a little bit of time left for questions. Just look at this. I just can't help myself. I have to end on a cartoon. What if we don't change at all and something magical just happens? Wouldn't that be great? Sorry. I think it's time for questions. So I think I hand over to Kerry. Are you there, Kerry?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate you turning your presentation upside down there as well at the end. Peter, we've had a couple of good questions come in here. I'm going to start one that's intriguing me here quite well. It says, who is your favorite science fiction author?
You know what one of the troubles about this is that I can either be truthful or I can be proper. Who is my favorite science fiction author? I guess I still really like people like Isaac Asimov. I think there is a tradition, and Philip Dick and people like that, there's a tradition of what I'm going to call mainstream, really very interesting, very fascinating science fiction authors. But right now, I'm just looking over to make sure I get her name right. My favorite science fiction author right now is a woman called Becky Chambers. Why do I like Becky Chambers? Because she makes me think about our world by talking about very different worlds, which are uncannily similar in some important ways to ours and similar in other ways. So if I had to nominate a favorite one for today, I'm going to say Becky Chambers. A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is a brilliant book.
All right. Peter, can you tell us more about backcasting? What does that look like?
Okay. So let's see if we can think of a quick example. Let's imagine, and I think it's a very sensible thing to imagine, that somewhere in the next few years, we will have got rid of the huge problem of a thing called a keyboard. A keyboard is a totally bizarre object. It dates from, I think, the 18th century, and it is an extraordinarily imperfect, slow, cumbersome way of communicating between yourself and someone through some kind of interface. So let's imagine we've moved forward in time, and today, all we need to do is to talk. When we talk, we can, without even thinking about it, call up the particular interface that we want to use. We can say what we want to say, and that information is then sent digitally to the person or group that you want to communicate with, and they hear what you're saying. And even better, they hear what you're saying in their own language. Now, you might think that sounds pretty fanciful. I don't think so. And why do I think it's not fanciful? Because I think we can now use the skill of backcasting and say, so what would need to happen to create a world where all you have to use is your voice and maybe nothing bigger than a watch to be able to communicate to anyone using any kind of technology or system you like? Well, that would require some changes. Let's just pick a couple. We could backcast and say, in order to get to that point, we have to have perfect voice computer or voice smartphone interfaces. What we have at the present time is we have things like naturally speaking, which converts speech into text, and some of you will use that doing sending out text messages. And we have things like Siri, where you ask a question and Siri, this marvelous electronic interface, bungles around and eventually finds something for you. Both of those are pretty imperfect. Naturally speaking and other language things still requires you to go and look at it and tidy it up and turn it into text. Siri is even more limited. Siri can only do the things that it has been set up to find for you. So the backcasting will say, we need to see if we can advance voice interface into digital devices. Once we can do that, then we're a little bit further down the path. So backcasting is saying, if we want to end up here, what will we need to be doing on the way to that place? And what does that mean we need to be doing today to start moving down that direction? I hope that makes sense as an example. It's about saying, look backwards from the future and work out what will be the staging posts that are necessary to achieve.
Great. Thanks, Peter. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. We've got one that says, what's your favorite reading to see the future? And then the add-on to that is, what sources would you recommend to learn more about developments in Africa? So maybe you can combine those two.
Okay. Actually, I'll do the second one first. You probably have to remind me of the first one. Sources on Africa, that's a really very good question. There are a number of different organizations that are good at collating information about countries overseas. And we'll go from the extreme to the more sensible. First of all, never discount the CIA. The CIA is a wonderful organization. I don't mean by that it does great stuff. What I mean by that is they produce something called the World Factbook. And the World Factbook is a collation of information about every country in the world. And in addition to that, which is a very good starting point, by the way, it gives you a lot of very valuable information, they also are required to publish their findings from their various studies, unless they can come up with some bizarre national security reason as to why they can't. So on the CIA.gov website, you'll find the World Factbook. You'll find lots of really very valuable studies about countries and developments that are taking place. Secondly, there are organizations like Foreign Affairs and similar, the Institute of International Affairs in London, which also have magazines, which also publish really good studies and surveys. So there are many sources of that kind, and many of those also publish very good analyses of what's happening in various countries. And somewhere like Nigeria right now is getting a lot of attention, a lot of good publications on that. I like The Economist. Unfortunately, I don't get 10% for recommending it. And The Economist Intelligent Unit EIU has a mass of really valuable information. It's probably the counterpoint to the CIA, another great source of details and information. So that's how I look at a country like Uganda. They're the sources I use for that. And Africa in particular, now there is a wealth of information, masses more than there used to be. Now, I think the first question was something about how do I keep in touch with the future or think about the future or read about the future?
It's kind of your favorite readings, Peter.
Yeah. Well, I've touched on one. I read The Economist quite a lot. What do I read about the future? I do read science fiction. I do read things like newspapers and read what opinion people are saying about trends that they see. And then I use some of those other sources I was talking about. So I really read quite widely. One of the things I do is this, and maybe this is a more helpful answer. I used to get lots of newspapers. I get less now, but I still get the New York Times and the Guardian. And I get the local North Carolina Winston-Salem fish wrap, as we call it. I don't read very much in newspapers, but what I do is I flip over the pages or I flip over the sections on the screen looking for things that strike me as interesting. So if I see an article which is about Nigeria, I'll click on that. If I see an article which is about quantum computing, I'll click on that. So my way of gathering information about the future, which is of course trying to understand what might happen, is to just identify promising looking articles, then read those at the end of the day. So I'm quite specifically careful. I don't spend a lot of time reading lots of stuff about current affairs. Of course I have to read some, and I'm embarrassed to say I don't read much about sport, but that means my mind is free to read some other stuff which suits the kind of interest I have.
Great. Peter, we've gotten about 3 questions that, again, the overarching ask is quite similar. What might be an approach for bringing others into the buy-in process for this sort of approach when they are not convinced? I've also, just to piggyback on that, how do you manage through resistance on upside down thinking? So as I said, we've gotten 2 or 3 questions in that in that content.
Okay, so there are 2 things about that, I think. Commitment has to come from participation. You can't make people feel committed. You can only get commitment if people get involved in doing something, which then gets them to start thinking about the things that you think are important. And so when I want to work with a group on strategic innovation, the people in the room and I need to build interest. The first step in building interest is that almost every business, almost every organization has some problems. So that the way you begin to develop an interest in strategic innovation is in fact to identify what the problems are today. What is it that's causing you grief? And then you can go through, in a sense, the steps I've just been talking about. You can say, well, in relation to that problem, what do we see happening in the next few years? How might that be affected? What do we think the trends are that are going on right now? People will happily comment on that. Then we can say something about, well, so tell me a bit more about these customers of yours. What are the, what are the things you hear from them? What do your people hear when they go out and talk to them? And they'll tell you a little bit about that. And then you can kind of sketch together a picture of what's going on right now, where things might head in the future, what customers are looking at right now. And then you can very gently say, so I wonder what it is that we're doing right now, which isn't as effective as we would like it to be. And strangely enough, quite often very resistant people say, well, the first thing we could do is, and immediately tell you there's a whole area of things that we do that aren't doing very much good at all. So the process has to be one that builds commitment. I'm just going to reinforce that. You'll only get people to think strategically and innovatively if they become involved in thinking innovatively and strategically. And there's a process you can gently move people down that track. And I find usually if you ask the kind of questions I've just been suggesting, people generally get pretty enthusiastic. That sounds interesting, especially if the starting point was a current problem.
Very good. Peter, question, what are the implications for classic organizational structures with multiple layers of supervision? In essence, when you think about moving forward with a strategic innovation process, who needs to be involved, and how would you overcome, some potential stumbling blocks with traditional organizational structures in terms of buy-in?
I got some lovely stories about that, but we don't have time for stories. But I guess if I was going to give a simple, quick answer to that, I would say two things are essential. If you want to have a group do something new, do something different, do something innovative, shelter them. Or as Tom Peters used to say, put them in a warehouse up the back, a skunk works. What is meant by that is people will only be able to really develop an innovative, game-changing approach to something if they're protected from all the normal expectations. But if they have to meet all the normal procedures and policies and activities, it's going to be very hard. That's the first thing. And so we quite often see very successful developments by companies that come out of a team being left sitting over on the sidelines with a highly motivated, highly capable group whose only task is to come up with something new, which is going to be good and profitable. That's one side of it. The other side of it is it only works also if the people at the very top, I don't mean managers, I mean the CEO and maybe the group managing directors are committed to supporting that group and to taking on its ideas when and if they come up with something. You need both sides. So you need support from the very top, which you probably won't articulate until you've got somewhere, and you need the freedom to be able to think outside of the normal rules. Very quickly, a great example of that was the development of the PlayStation. The man who developed the PlayStation was working in Sony on the Sony Trinitron television, and he was bored. And his job was to get the interface working between the television and one of those little console things. And he kept telling his boss, I could come up with something better. And his boss said, make the television better. So eventually he went away, and without talking to anyone, he developed the beginnings of what became the Sony PlayStation. But he was smart enough to know he would never persuade his boss. So what he did was, he actually set up a demonstration of his PlayStation in a cleaning cupboard just outside the CEO's office on the top floor of the Sony building. One day the guy came out, he saw this guy in there fiddling around, and said, what the hell are you doing? And he showed him the PlayStation, and that was it. That was it. The PlayStation began. So it really rather nicely captures you need to be hidden, do what you need to do, and then get commitment from the very top.
Good. Peter, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I've got one question I hope you'll be able to address in about 30 seconds. And that question is, let me just get back here. What is one thing happening now or coming out of the kind of the post-COVID-19 crisis you think will not happen?
That's a very good question. I don't think the face of business is going to be fundamentally changed across America. I think, unfortunately, a very large number of businesses, a very large number of organizations will succumb to the inertia of doing what they've always done. Many of them will find it very difficult, and many of them will persist despite the difficulties. So I don't think we're going to see a major revolution in America, in business, in activity, sadly. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Well, Peter, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for leading our telecast or webcast today. I'd also like to thank our participants for investing the last hour with us. And for those of you who may not be aware, The Wake Forest Executive Education team provides some open enrollment programs as well as programs customized for personal and professional development. I'd like to stress that the content Peter just presented is part of a broader one-day program in strategic innovation and leadership that will be held on September 1st at the Wake Forest Charlotte Center. If you're interested in additional information on that program, just visit our website, some information here on the screen. But I'd like to thank again everybody for joining us today, and please stay safe and healthy. Thanks again.